It's February 1996. Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green have just been released for the Game Boy in Japan and will soon become a worldwide phenomenon, with approximately 45 million copies sold. Pokémon Red, Green, Blue and Yellow are among the best-selling games of all time, and many years later, the Game Boy classics would become the foundation for the most successful multimedia franchise of all time. The success of the first-gen Pokémon games was so great that Nintendo also wanted Pokémon on their home console, the Nintendo 64. While the Game Boy was incredibly successful, the Nintendo 64 could not compete with its competition, which is why Pokémon may have been the game that Nintendo needed at the time. Thus, Nintendo worked on a completely original Pokémon RPG for the Nintendo 64, Pocket Monsters 64. Pocket Monsters 64 was the working title, so not the final title, for the Nintendo 64 Pokémon game. It would have been the first real Pokémon RPG for home consoles, many years before Pokémon Colosseum and Pokémon XD would finally make this dream reality. The big difference, however, was that Pokémon 64 was supposed to be developed by Game Freak, unlike the future Pokémon games Pokémon Colosseum and Pokémon XD. Pocket Monsters 64 was not supposed to be a completely normal Nintendo 64 game though, but a game for the new Nintendo 64 disk drive, also known as the 64DD. The 64DD was a console extension that made it possible to play discs on the N64. The game was supposed to use this technology, but in the end it was never released, and only a few pieces of information are known about the game. Over the years, it became one of the biggest mysteries in gaming history, as many people were looking forward to the Pokémon game. Since even gameplay of the game is unknown, I will show you some fan-created screenshots of how it could have looked like on the hardware. In 1997, Shigeru Miyamoto responded to a question about the current status of the game in an interview, saying, "This game will be released with the Nintendo 64 disk drive. There are currently 10 people working on it. It will be released in Japan, but I'm not sure about the US." However, when the Nintendo 64 DD was released in 1999, there was no sign of the game. In another Nintendo 64 DD interview, it was stated that 3 Pokémon games were in development for the 64 DD, the aforementioned Pocket Monsters 64, Pokémon Snap and Pokémon Stadium. None of these games ended up being 64 DD titles, but instead normal N64 games, which was probably the better decision since the 64 DD was a huge flop and was discontinued shortly after production began. The reason why they became N64 games instead of 64 DD games was likely due to the fact that the 64 DD was delayed for several years. Originally slated for a March 1997 release, it didn't come out until winter 1999, which would have affected many other projects due to this delay. All 3 titles would have used the 64 DD, as well as the same Pokémon models. In the same interview, it was also stated that the games would be compatible with the new Pokémon from Pokémon Gold and Pokémon Silver, expanding the player experience in some ways, although it is unclear how. However, when the Nintendo event, Nintendo Space World 1997 started, only 2 Pokémon games were unveiled: Pokémon Stadium and Pokémon Snap. There was no sign of Pocket Monsters 64, and nothing more would be said about the Pokémon game in the future ever again. In a later interview, Junichi Masuda of Game Freak stated that he believed that Pokémon RPGs should not be on home consoles, which may have been why the project was cancelled. It should also be noted that at this time, Game Freak was also working on Pokémon Gold and Pokémon Silver and were having significant problems, which likely meant they could only focus on one project at a time. The fact that Pokémon Gold and Silver were delayed for almost 2 years also indicates these difficulties. Ultimately, we will probably never know why development on the game was cancelled, but it still is interesting to think about what could have been.